So welcome everyone to our Instagram Live. Today I'm talking to Cindy Wasser from Hope Springs Fertility Law. We have always had lots of questions about surrogacy in the US, about egg donation in the US, about IVF in the US. And with the recent overturning of Roe versus Wade, we've even had more questions about same-sex marriage and about alternative family building for the LGBTQ plus community. And so there's some real questions around that. And we support parents who travel anywhere doing surrogacy. So many of our Canadian clients have traveled to the US, many of our international clients have traveled to the US. And so Cindy, what I'm wondering is if you can talk about sort of these top 5 pieces that people really need to consider as they are moving forward with this process.
Absolutely. So I would say that the top 5 considerations today for choosing between Canada and US are as follows. The fact that this is an altruistic program and theirs is commercial. The fact that it costs less money in Canada than in the US. The fact that there's a difference in Canadian versus American citizenship, and that the US has taxation implications for people called expats or Americans who live abroad, which would be those children, and we don't. And the number one as of today would certainly be the issue of abortion and potential use of embryos coming up in the future, as well as possibly LGBTQ rights. So I'm going to start with that one and see where the rest take us with time, because they won't take very long. As probably everybody knows who watches any social media and listens to the news, the United States Supreme Court recently overturned the principles of Roe versus Wade in a case brought to it that has had the effect of closing down abortion clinics in many states. And what they said is that the right to abortion in the United States is not a constitutional right that therefore can be protected by the federal government across the whole US. Instead, it is something that the individual state has jurisdiction to legislate upon, which has enabled many states to legislate against abortion in that state. Many states were waiting ruling and had proposed legislation ready for the state governor to sign, and they did that immediately. Others are planning their legislation now. At the same time, many states also enacted legislation that said you could have an abortion in that state. We are anticipating more and more states will rule against abortion than there will be. A big issue as a result of that is, can someone travel out of their state where it's prohibited to a state where it is allowed to have abortion? At this moment, the answer is yes, legally speaking. Practically speaking is a whole other issue that I want to address. Legally speaking, the laws with respect to freedom of movement within the United States as a country are in fact constitutionally protected, meaning the whole country must allow freedom of movement. But we rather suspect, with good reason, that those states that are very, very much against abortion, that really, whose governments really believe it is murder, will be working very hard on finding a loophole in order to prevent that travel. So from a practical aspect, we have not just the issue of reasonable fear in the near future, but what we are seeing is that if someone is pregnant in a prohibited state and wanting an abortion, they have to travel. Now, who can do that and in what circumstances? And how does this relate to any of you? Well, it could be your surrogate. So I have recently, in the last 2 weeks, saw 2 posts about surrogates in the United States, 2 in 1 week, who required abortions and were having trouble going to another state. The nearby states were all prohibited states, or else clinics were refusing to do it out of fear, I guess. And what this meant was that the surrogate who needed an abortion very quickly in dire need, and a fetus that may very well have been suffering, went through enormous emotional stress and anxiety that would no doubt have physical ramifications in trying to deal with this and navigate it. And from the intended parent's point of view, I could only imagine, having been an intended parent with a surrogate myself, that I would feel incredible anxiety about my own fetus, the loss, the grief, but having to see my surrogate sacrifice this for my well-being, for me to have a family, and putting herself in such grave danger and such emotional stress. And I was moved to talk about that today because I think that is the number one issue. The rest is really money. But there's nothing we can do about the fear and emotional stress related to not having the freedom to decide whether to raise a child that has significant illness, congenital disability, or know that the child may in fact not survive very long and will be in great pain, and to put the surrogate through that.
And I want to jump in there. This is not, I mean, yes, absolutely. This is about the fetus that the surrogate is carrying. But in some cases, this is about the surrogate's health. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the surrogate may develop a condition that is not compatible with pregnancy, whether it's hypertension or other significant health issues where the termination of a pregnancy is required to save her life, which is, you know, a decision all on its own in terms of a surrogate balancing against the intended parent's wishes, balancing against what the legal agreement says. And so, you know, all of those pieces now that, depending on which state your surrogate lives in, you know, is compromised. It adds another layer. And, you know, Cindy, if you could talk a little bit about, you know, are we at risk in Canada of this type of law, or are we, where are we on that?
So yeah, there's a big difference. And I just want to add that in some states where abortion is prohibited, there are some exemptions, and some states will exempt where the surrogate or the pregnant woman's life is at stake, the pregnant person's life is at risk. But that requires a doctor or a team, a whole process of identifying that. And by then there can be a lot of suffering. So in Canada, it's different. So we have a constitution and a charter of rights that applies to the entire country. And our charter of rights has a section in it, section 7, which says everybody is entitled to life and liberty and protection of the person, so to speak. I'm paraphrasing. And we've had the largest case revolving around abortion and dealt with Morgentaler and the Queen, in which Dr. Morgentaler was performing abortions and was challenged many years ago. And our court said that the right to abortion and the right to control one's body comes within the Charter of Rights. And then our criminal code was amended so that abortion is not a crime. So the criminal code applies across the country as well. So no province or territory in Canada can make laws with respect to the criminal element of abortion. And since that time, what we've noticed in our politics is that any time a potential politician or elected politician has spoken or uttered the concept of abolishing abortion, they've actually been turfed by their own parties in some cases. And the only time we've heard the conversation about abortion raised in the House of Parliament or government was recently with respect to this decision in the US, where our government and the other leaders all said that this was horrible and really, really strongly worded their shock that the US Supreme Court would do this, and their concern for women and pregnant people in the United States. And our government has said they are welcome here to have abortion services if they can get here. And of course, the problem is this affects marginalized people who can't afford the travel aspects. And the agencies in the US are very concerned about that. And of course, they'll be looking to the intended parents of pregnant surrogates to pay the costs of moving the surrogate, which I'm sure all would of course do in the circumstances, but it's another financial risk that people didn't consider. And whether any of the health insurance in those states will cover is another thing. If it becomes illegal, then health insurance would not likely be able to cover an illegal activity. So if there's a complication, what happens? I don't know. A lot of scary things right now, and until it all gets sorted out, which will take some time, it's a huge risk to take with making a baby. It's not a risk that most people would take with buying a car. So I can't imagine why they would do it with having a baby.
So what are the other sort of key components around surrogacy in the US for Canadians or for those listening from abroad?
So a big consideration that people don't often think about or are not, I find, told is that the taxation rules in the US require anyone living abroad earning income in that country to report it to the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS of the United States, their taxation department. And depending on the income status of the person, they may end up paying taxes in the US on their earned income in their country. So while this may not affect too many people because they don't earn enough to worry about it, I have had many clients who are of great means and have private banking issues, and they do not want under any circumstances to have their child's income reported at all. And that's a big consideration. And they have moved mountains to have Canadian babies as a result of that. So it's important to realize that this is a lifetime thing. A parent is not allowed to withdraw their child from US citizenship. And if the child does it right at 18, when they become an adult, it is deemed to have been done for taxation purposes and could be prevented by the United States. So it's very tricky. You have to think about the future income, not just what you may be left with after a surrogacy project. So that's one. The citizenship issue is a big one. It's one that I have trouble speaking about factually as a lawyer, though, because I will say experience dictates when you're traveling around Europe and you say you're Canadian versus American, you do get a different welcoming. But in terms of protection, that Canadian citizenship is your Willy Wonka gold ticket, so to speak, to a safe country where we don't really see terrorist threats. And I've had a lot of European clients reach out to me since the war in Ukraine broke out saying, does our child's Canadian citizenship allow us to come to Canada if things progress in Europe? And in fact, the answer is yes, that Canadian baby will always be welcome here. And our laws say that the parents may come to Canada to join with their child, so they would be allowed to travel here and be here and likely get refugee and then permanent residency status and citizenship quickly. Canada has always welcomed people. And then there's the issue of cost and altruism, which I'll combine because they're joint, but with some separate factors. So we are not allowed to pay donors and surrogates in Canada. We're not allowed to pay agencies for the match itself. Agencies are legal as long as they perform a service other than just matching. So they're well recognized and accepted by the government as legal entities and big taxpayers. Donors and surrogates are allowed to be reimbursed for their expenses. And in fact, under the law, they're allowed to get paid. It's the person paying who can't do it. But the person having a donor or surrogate or an agency reimbursing them may do so for any expense related to the journey. And that's a wide range of expenses. As long as it's related to the journey, it'll be legal. However, that does make it less expensive in most cases. And then add to it, clinics, legal fees, agency fees are generally less expensive. And then sadly for us, there is the value of the dollar to factor into that, making a huge difference, sadly, and getting worse. So it's good for anyone who is outside of Canada to do it here. What else that means in terms of cost as well is the healthcare aspect of it. We have universal healthcare in Canada, like many European countries. We pay for healthcare through our taxes, but when we go to hospital or doctor, we don't pay extra. In the United States, they do not have universal healthcare, so people buy private health insurance, and there are all kinds of programs that you purchase policies for surrogacy as well. And they are very complicated. I wouldn't even begin to address them. We send everyone to Art Risk and for any of those things, and they're the pros on American surrogacy. But there's time frames, there's the cost depending on where and what. And then, so you pay a large fee for the surrogate's health insurance as well as the newborn. And because healthcare is more expensive, the newborn policy is more expensive. You do need to purchase that in Canada, but it's less expensive than American plans. And again, you're likely paying for it in Canadian dollars. So, although some are American. So those are the main issues. And I don't know, Leah, are we opening up to any questions if people type them in?
If anyone has any questions, please post them in the comments. For myself, it's interesting as all of these sort of new pieces of information have come out around Roe versus Wade and around, alternative family building in the US. And, we've seen a large number of clients moving embryos to Canada, even for their own IVF, because there is sort of this question mark around, if conception begins, when conception begins, what to do with excess embryos. Can embryos be genetically tested in certain states and discarded if they are not genetically normal? There really are so many questions about IVF, and I think we're just starting to see those questions come up and arise.
Yeah.
And so, I think that we will definitely be on these lives as more news comes in and as more information is available around IVF and restricted IVF for people based on the state in which their embryos were created. And so if you're an intended parent who has embryos housed in a state where you are concerned that access to IVF in the future may be limited, please reach out to myself or Cindy. We would love to provide you information on clinics in Canada who routinely accept embryos and have packages available to accommodate, sort of picking up where you left off in terms of your IVF journey.
Thank you for raising that, because I actually did want to go into a bit about the embryo issue. In some states where they've defined abortion as, the killing of a life, this raises the concern: if they define conception as the beginning of life, then what are these embryos? And so a lot of agencies have raised the concern that, and clinics as well in the US, that they won't be able to do testing on embryos, that they may not be able to do research and destroy excess embryos, that every embryo will have to be used to create a life. We're not quite sure how that will practically work out, because then that would actually be forcing people to get surrogates to get pregnant for them, which does sound very much like Margaret Atwood and Handmaid's Tale. Because if you made embryos because you couldn't get pregnant and you were having a surrogate in the first place, then how do you use your embryos? Or will they be forcing you to donate them to families in need, in which case you're almost being forced to adopt sibling babies out? So lots of complications, lots of court cases coming with the definition of life. And it doesn't, I'm not fear-mongering saying the sky is falling, get out of the US, because it's hard to believe that it will go so far. But from a stress level right now, it's it's a question. It's a reasonable question to ask, what will happen if I spend all that money and create my embryos there? There's also concerns about LGBTQ rights because, of course, one of the significant members of the court, of course, they're all significant at that level, but Clarence Thomas said there are no constitutional rights for the LGBT community and opened the door for states to bring actions in this way. So it's pretty scary. We won't have those challenges here. We do not think conception begins with the creation of an embryo or the beginning of a pregnancy. Life in Canada begins at birth. There has to be a heartbeat, and a brain wave. And the only exception to considering a fetus as a person that I'm aware of is the recent amendment to the Canadian Immigration Citizenship Act that happened in July of 2020 as a result of COVID, where a very limited definition of parenthood was created so that international people having babies via surrogate could be considered parents to get into the country during COVID, to be here for the birth of those babies in advance of their birth, because there was also a 2-week quarantine period and they needed to be early. And that was to, in effect, that gave international intended parents greater rights than Canadians over becoming parents, because they were parents in advance at a federal level, which is extraordinary. But that's an indication of how safe Canada is for surrogacy and LGBTQ rights.
Absolutely. We saw amazing things through COVID in terms of the government showing up for intended parents, physicians showing up for intended parents, processes being built so that intended parents outside of the province in which the fertility clinic was that they were working within could have their sperm shipped. And same for overseas clients. It's really been an amazing evolution of the industry through COVID, and it's been the mother of invention in so many ways. And so thank you, Cindy. I don't see any questions, but if you do have any questions, please send us a DM either to us at CFC Families or to Cindy at Hope Springs Fertility Law. And we'll be back, I'm sure, next week with another topic to tackle. Have a great day.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye, everybody.